Let's talk about the structuralist perspective on the state. Now, if you remember, the instrumentalist perspective is that the state is an instrument. It's a tool that is essentially wielded by the bourgeoisie, the power elite of society, to maintain their interests, to serve their interests, and to maintain their status as the dominant class in society. So the instrumentalist theory is that the state is an instrument. It's a tool to be used by the power elite to serve their interests. In contrast to the instrumentalist theory is the structuralist theory. Now, the structuralist theory, as you might imagine by the name, is all about the structures of society. And the structuralist theory of the state is that the state was born alongside, as a result of, the capitalist mode of production. Frederick Engels actually has a really good quote here, kind of laying out, alluding to the structuralist position. He says, "The state is therefore by no means a power forced on society from without, just as little as it is the reality of an ethical idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it has split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves and society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arisen out of society but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state." So the structuralist theory of the state is that the state exists independently of any one class, of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, that the state actually functions to perpetuate the capitalist mode of production, and that is its sole interest. So the argument here is that the state arose out of capitalism to protect the capitalist mode of production and to ensure its survival. So it doesn't have either of the class interests in mind. Now, however, it does oftentimes align with the interest of the bourgeoisie, because their interest also is to perpetuate the capitalist mode of production, because they are benefiting clearly from this mode of production. They sit at the top of society with the most resources and the most power. So oftentimes the state, according to the structuralist theory, does align itself with the bourgeois class, but this is merely just a coincidence because the state and the bourgeois class have a shared interest, and that sometimes it actually does align itself with the interests of the proletariat and go against the interests of the bourgeoisie. So as an example, when the state implements social welfare programs or minimum wage policies, or recognizes, solidifies to the legal system the rights of unions and collective bargaining and so forth, this goes actually against the interests of the bourgeoisie and aligns with the interests of the proletariat, but the state is willing to do so because it perpetuates the capitalist mode of production by, and this is important, temporarily placating the proletariat. So the argument goes that, and we've read this in the manifesto of the Communist Party and so forth, that the proletariat will eventually rise up and revolt against the bourgeoisie and bring an end to the capitalist mode of production. The structuralist theory of the state suggests that the state functions to prevent this from happening as long as absolutely possible. So it does things to make the proletariat class temporarily satisfied. Things like minimum wage laws, things like protecting unionization and collective bargaining rights through the legal system and so forth. Even those don't align with the interests of the bourgeoisie directly, immediately, they do perpetuate the capitalist mode of production by essentially preventing the revolution, by making the proletariat temporarily happy. Now, scholars of the structuralist theory argue that though it does align with the long-term interests of the bourgeoisie, so it might not have their short-term interests in mind. Very clearly, a minimum wage law goes against the interests of the bourgeoisie who want to purchase labor for as cheaply as possible, but they argue that it perpetuates the capitalist mode of production for a longer period of time, which clearly has the long-term interests of the bourgeoisie in mind. So keep in mind that the structuralist theory it's all about the structures of society and their interrelationships, and the state is one social institution that exists within the capitalist mode of production. And it exists independently from the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, even though it oftentimes aligns the interests of the state and the interests of the bourgeoisie align with one another because they both have an interest in perpetuating the capitalist mode of production. There are times, in fact, when the state will align its interests with the proletariat, though in theory, this keeps the long-term interests of the bourgeoisie in mind.